friends. Welcome to Nerdy Bitz, TLDL, Too Long Didn't Listen. I'm your host, the Reverend Tracy, and this is where we take one study, one concept, or one piece of psychology and break it down so you get all the nerdy good stuff without the textbook hangover. So today we get to talk about Gilmore Girls, which honestly feels appropriate around Mother's Day because Gilmore Girls has become one of those massively beloved comfort shows centered around the idea of an unusually close mother-daughter relationship. For a lot of people, Lorelai and Rory are basically the cultural blueprint for best friend moms. And I think that's part of why this conversation matters. And before the internet comes for me immediately, I do need to clarify something. I have actually never fully watched this show, which somehow makes this entire conversation even funnier because despite successfully avoiding Gilmore Girls for most of my life, I apparently still absorbed enough through clips, commercials, snippets, discourse, and you just have to watch it conversations to develop concerns about the family system's dynamics. And then a couple of years ago, I came across an article from family therapist Hilary May explaining why she would not watch the show with her own daughter. And honestly, it basically confirmed the vague psychological discomfort I already had about the little bits of the show I had been exposed to through pure cultural osmosis. Because once I started reading her explanation, I realized this conversation is actually much bigger than one TV show. Because what we're really talking about is the difference between emotional closeness and emotional enmeshment. And more specifically, a concept in family systems psychology called parentification. Now, parentification is basically when a child starts taking on emotional or relational roles that developmentally belong to the parent. That does not necessarily mean literal caregiving like paying bills, setting appointments, or raising siblings, although sometimes it can. Sometimes it's emotional. The child becomes the confidant, the emotional regulator, the stabilizing force in the relationship, the safe place for the parent to vent. And one of the phrases Hilary May uses that I think is incredibly helpful is flow of care. The idea that in a healthy developmental relationship, emotional care primarily flows downward from parent to child. Not because children never emotionally support parents at all, but because the parent is supposed to remain the more emotionally grounded and developmentally stable person in that relationship. And when that flow starts consistently reversing, the child can quietly become responsible for emotional roles they were never really supposed to carry. And according to therapists who critique the show, that's part of what's happening in Gilmore Girls. The relationship is framed as extremely emotionally close, which is why so many people find it comforting and aspirational even. They're witty, they're affectionate, they feel more like best friends than a traditional parent-child relationship. And I think this is where the conversation gets really interesting because I don't actually think most people watch this dynamic and think, wow, that seems unhealthy. I think media has normalized this so effectively that many people interpret emotional enmeshment as ideal closeness. And this is something Tim and I have talked about before on the main show. The idea that entertainment doesn't just reflect culture, it also helps normalize it. Not usually in some intentional conspiracy way, more in a repeated exposure way. This dynamic keeps getting framed as charming, loving, relatable, or aspirational kind of way. And when certain relationship patterns get packaged with warmth, humor, nostalgia, and emotional intimacy long enough, people stop examining the pattern itself, and they just absorb the emotional framing around it, which is part of why I think conversations like this get complicated so quickly, because many people are not reacting to the actual psychological dynamic. They're reacting to the feeling the dynamic gives them. And to be fair, part of why this works is because warmth is genuinely present. That's important because unhealthy family systems are not always cold or obviously abusive. Sometimes they're deeply affectionate. Sometimes they genuinely love each other very much. That's what makes blurred boundaries harder to recognize. The issue isn't the closeness. The issue is the role confusion. And from what therapists point out about the show, Rory often ends up functioning less like a child and more like an emotional peer to Lorelai. Somebody helping emotionally regulate situations. Somebody carrying adult-level emotional information. Somebody who, at times, feels partially responsible for Lorelai emotionally. And honestly, this connects to another thing I've talked about before, which is my mild skepticism toward how culture romanticizes being an empath like it's basically a superpower. Because sometimes what people are describing as extreme emotional sensitivity is actually a form of hypervigilance, a skill developed by kids who learned early that their emotional safety depended on accurately reading the moods, reactions, and emotional states of the adults around them. And to be clear, being emotionally perceptive is not necessarily bad. That can absolutely become genuine empathy. But those two things are not automatically identical. Sometimes hyperattunement starts as adaptation at first. And I think that's part of why dynamics like this can feel emotionally rewarding while still creating developmental complications underneath the surface. Because the child often becomes very emotionally skilled, very aware, very responsive, but sometimes at the expense of learning where their emotional responsibilities actually end as the child. And here's the part I think gets lost in a lot of these conversations. Adolescence and teenage development actually require something from parents that friendship alone cannot fully provide. Teenagers need emotional safety, warmth, trust, and connection. Absolutely, you won't hear the opposite from me. But they also need structure, boundaries, containment, somebody who can remain emotionally grounded when they cannot. Part of adolescence is testing limits, developing identity, pushing boundaries, and learning emotional regulation. And that process works best when there is still a stable parent-child structure underneath the closeness, which brings me to one of the funniest possible places to find parenting wisdom, American Dad. So there's an episode where a character explains to Stan that being a friend is easy, but being a father means setting an example and sometimes doing things your kids will not enjoy in the moment. And immediately after saying that, he disciplines his son. Now, obviously, for the purposes of this conversation, you can replace father with mother or honestly just parent because the underlying point is developmental, not gendered. And underneath the joke, that's actually a really solid insight because parenting and friendship are not interchangeable roles. A healthy parent-child relationship absolutely should include warmth, humor, trust, emotional safety, and connection. Please don't unhear that. But parenting also requires the ability to tolerate not always being liked, to hold boundaries, to model regulation, to remain the emotionally grounded person in the room when your child cannot be. And I think one of the quiet dangers of romanticizing emotionally enmeshed parent-child relationships is that children can grow up without fully developing some of those internal structures themselves. Not because they were unloved, not because the parent was evil, but because emotional purehood slowly replaced developmental parenting in subtle ways. And sometimes what happens later is that the child has to start rebuilding those structures themselves as an adult. Learning boundaries, later. Learning emotional regulation, later. Learning that love and caregiving are not supposed to be the same thing, later. Basically, reparenting parts of themselves that never fully got modeled in the first place. And I know reparenting did come up on our most recent episode, which is another reason why I thought it was interesting to bring up this article today. And I do want to be careful here because none of any of this means emotionally close parents are bad parents. Honestly, a lot of these dynamics probably come from parents trying to create the kind of emotional closeness we ourselves never received growing up. That part is real too. But closeness and boundaries are not opposites. In healthy systems, they're supposed to exist together. So I guess my issue with Gilmore Girls is not actually that the relationship feels loving. It's that the relationship is so often framed as aspirational without people stopping to ask whether emotional intimacy and emotional role confusion are always the same thing. Because they're not. A child should absolutely feel emotionally safe with their parent, but they should not quietly become emotionally responsible for them. And I think that's the distinction that sometimes gets lost. And that's your Nerdy Bitz. And apparently mine is that I have strong opinions about a show I have technically never watched.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.